Most women mistake obsession for love, and most men confuse need with connection. But beneath the rituals of modern romance, beneath the texts, the touches, the tangled sheets, there lies something far older, far more dangerous. The unconscious wound that drives him back to her, not because he loves her, but because her absence activates the parts of him he cannot face alone. She was never just a woman. She was a mirror he wasn't ready to look into. A woman anchored in her silence is not a mystery to be solved. She is a force that dismantles the male ego in ways it cannot predict. When she retreats, not out of pettiness, but out of self-possession, he does not chase love. He chases the parts of himself that vanished when her silence arrived, because her silence does something his logic cannot fight. It speaks without sound. It touches without presence. It reflects every unconscious shadow he buried beneath the armor of confidence and conquest. And that is what addicts him. You see, Jung taught us that what we do not make conscious will return to us as fate. And in relationships, fate often looks like longing. But longing in this case is not for her warmth, her words, or her love. It is for the feeling of being undone in her presence. A presence that, now gone, leaves him naked with himself. He can't admit this. He will call it attraction. He will call it chemistry. But it is something more primal. He is not obsessed with her. He is obsessed with what her stillness awakens in him. Most men are trained to pursue control, status, resolution, but she offers him none. The feminine in its sacred form is not validation. It is revelation. It does not soothe his ego. It seduces his shadow. She is the storm he thought he could master, but in reality, she was never meant to be held, only witnessed, only respected. And when she withdraws, not to punish, but to protect the temple of her spirit, he is left in a space few men are prepared to inhabit, the space of unprocessed hunger. It is in this space that the real spiritual work begins. But few will do it. Few will stay with the discomfort long enough to trace the pain back to its origin. The mother wound, the emotional neglect, the trauma buried beneath masculinity's silence. Instead, many will chase, text, control. Return to old lovers or distractions, because her silence has become unbearable, and unbearable things, when not healed, are often hunted. Do you know how many women are pursued not for who they are, but for the ache they awaken? How many men knock on doors they themselves closed, not because they realized her value, but because her absence left a void they don't know how to hold? A woman rooted in her inner knowing doesn't explain her distance. She doesn't retaliate. She simply exits the scripts she once begged to be written into, and that is what makes her unforgettable. She has stopped pleading, stopped proving. She no longer performs softness for the sake of staying. Her silence is not empty, it is sacred. And it terrifies the part of him still chained to dependency disguised as desire. Because this silence is not just an absence of voice, it is the presence of power. Jung warned us that the feminine, when fully embodied, evokes the unconscious in men, not the surface-level wants, but the buried fears, the unspoken griefs, the boy who never felt chosen, the man who performs strength but secretly craves surrender. And in her stillness, he begins to see her not as someone to win, but as someone whose absence makes him feel more than her presence ever could. That is not love. That is emotional addiction. But here's the truth that unravels everything. She didn't go silent to make him miss her. She went silent because she finally heard herself. And in that moment, she realized she was never meant to be a salve for his unhealed story. He will call it confusion. He will call it a phase. But deep in the marrow of his psyche, he knows something ancient has been stirred, something that cannot be soothed by answers or closure. Her silence is not a tactic. It is an initiation, not into loneliness, but into truth. For the first time, he sits alone in the presence of what she used to carry for him, her emotional labor, her constant reassurance, her endless softness that wrapped itself around his jagged edges, convincing him he was whole. But now, there is no one left to soften the echo. This is where many men recoil. They seek a new woman, a new fixation, another performance of intimacy to distract from the storm her absence left behind. But the ones who truly evolve, the rare few, do not run. They stay. They suffer. They listen. Because her silence was never about punishment. It was the final mirror. The feminine is never louder than when she withdraws. And when that feminine is rooted in spiritual clarity, not games, not pride, not wounded retreat, she becomes untouchable. not because she is hard, but because she is whole. He feels this wholeness like a ghost haunting his ribcage. It makes him restless, addicted, possessive, but not out of love, out of hunger. Hunger for the emotional holding she used to offer without him asking. Hunger for the softness that made him feel chosen. Hunger for the spiritual womb she unknowingly opened in him, then closed, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Because a woman can only bleed for a man's healing for so long before she begins to die from the wounds he refuses to name. So she stops, she lets go, not in rage, but in reverence for herself. And that's when the real withdrawal begins, for him, not from her body, but from the emotional drug her presence had become. He begins to spiral. He analyzes the texts. He replays the conversations. He wonders when exactly she started to leave him, emotionally, spiritually, silently. But that's the thing about the feminine when it awakens. She doesn't slam the door. She dissolves. She disappears from within the connection, long before her feet ever walk out the door. And when she's gone, what remains is a hollow shell of intimacy that echoes with everything he failed to hear while she was still speaking. Jung spoke of the anima, the inner feminine in every man. And it is her silence that forces this archetype to the surface. He sees her everywhere now, in dreams, in strangers, in songs. She is no longer just a woman. She has become a symbol, not of loss, but of longing. And longing, when left unresolved, mutates into obsession, not with her, but with the version of himself he tasted in her presence. Because she gave him access to parts of himself he didn't know how to reach alone. His tenderness, his truth, his terror, his trembling hunger to be seen beyond performance. But that access had a cost. It required her sacrifice. And now she chooses something else, not revenge, not silence as cruelty, but silence as sanctuary. She doesn't answer the message. She doesn't post to provoke. She doesn't return the energy he casts into the void, because she's no longer trying to be chosen. She's busy choosing herself. And yet even now, even in the space between them, she remains unforgettable, because she touched him in the place no other woman dared enter. The soul beneath his ego, the wound behind his confidence, the child inside the man. And that is what haunts him. Not her perfume, not her smile, not the way she said his name, but the silence she left behind, and everything it continues to say. A man may forget the words she spoke. He may forget the shape of her voice in the dark, the texture of her hand wrapped around his weakness. But he will not forget the feeling of her retreat, because it wasn't absence. It was exposure. In that silence, she stopped participating in the illusion that love meant holding what he refused to heal, that her softness was a currency to buy his attention, that her presence alone could fix what he buried beneath bravado. And that was the moment he began to unravel. Jung taught that the psyche will do anything to avoid pain until it no longer can. And when the feminine disappears, not in anger but in indifference, she becomes the very pain his psyche has no defense against. He might call her cold. He might say she changed. But deep down, he knows. She simply awakened. She stopped answering the questions he never asked. She stopped mothering the man who refused to father his own soul. She stopped bleeding in the name of love. And now, with the silence pressing against the chambers of his mind, he is forced into confrontation with the shadow he's long denied. Not the one that lashes out in rage, but the one that begs silently not to be left. This is not the kind of addiction that thrills. It devastates, because it's not about her anymore. It's about the emptiness she revealed. He doesn't love her. Not truly. Not yet. Because love is not the ache we feel in her absence. Love is the presence we bring to her existence. And that is what he never learned. He never learned that love is not conquest. It's not her silence cracking under pressure. It's not her boundaries eroding just to make space for his validation. Love is accountability. It is witnessing the feminine without needing to dominate her. It is holding the mirror she becomes and not flinching. But addiction is different. Addiction feeds on lack, on fantasy, on projection, on the longing for something we were never willing to hold with reverence when we had it. When she was there, laughing, waiting, hoping, he mistook her presence for permanence. He assumed her softness was endless, that her patience was his to squander, because part of him believed she needed him to choose her, that her value rose and fell with his attention. But now, in the echoing wake of her withdrawal, something darker settles in. She never needed him. She only wanted him, and now she doesn't even want. That is what breaks him. Because to a man who still believes his worth lies in being needed, her detachment is unbearable. He cannot seduce it. He cannot fix it. He cannot argue his way back into her heart. Because her heart is no longer on the table. It has returned to her body, to her soul, to the quiet sanctuary of a woman who has remembered who she is outside of being desired. And what he doesn't yet realize is this: her silence has become her language, her boundary has become her compass, and her distance is no longer a test, it's a truth. This is where the story begins to shift. Because the man who continues chasing her silence will never catch it. He's not chasing her. He's running from the version of himself that cannot survive without her energy. And if he's willing, truly willing, he will one day understand. Her silence was not the villain. It was the invitation to grow, to burn, to descend into the fire of himself. But that descent is not guaranteed. Most men stay at the edge. They repeat the cycles. They look for another version of her, not realizing it was never about her. It was about the part of himself she activated and the parts she refused to carry. She let him go to save herself. And in doing so, she gave him the only thing he ever truly needed, the space to meet himself, without her, without the noise, without the mask, just the silence and the choice. The silence of a woman who has awakened is not absence, it is alchemy. It transmutes everything. Her tears, once explanations, become prayers for peace. Her waiting, once laced with desperation, transforms into devotion to herself. And her love, once poured endlessly into the unready, returns inward like a tide reclaiming the shoreline. This is what he feels now, the shift. It's not just that she's gone. It's that she has become unreachable, not physically, emotionally, energetically. Her frequency has changed. She no longer vibrates at the level of proving. She no longer resonates with the man who needed her more than he saw her. And that difference, it scorches him. Because when she loved him, he didn't see it as rare. He saw it as familiar, expected. And now, in her absence, he sees what he never did when she stood before him in her softness. He sees her power, not because she flaunts it, but because she no longer offers it freely. Jung warned us about projections, that we don't see people as they are, we see them as we are. And when a woman loves without boundaries, she becomes a screen, a canvas for his unmet needs, his mother's absence, his father's silence, his own self-hatred dressed up in desire. And when she stops playing that role, when she takes herself off his stage, when she dares to be a woman rather than a vessel, he doesn't know what to do with her anymore, because he never truly saw her. He saw what he wanted to feel in her presence. And this is the addiction. Not to her, to the fantasy, to the idea that someone could make him whole without him having to bleed for it, without him having to confront the boy inside who never felt chosen, without facing the pain he stuffed into the corners of his psyche like broken toys he never learned to play with. Now her silence whispers truths he can no longer silence. That he treated her like a well that would never run dry. That he mistook her devotion for weakness. That he believed she needed his love more than he needed his healing. But the most painful truth of all, she doesn't miss him the way he thinks. Because she has tasted freedom. Not the kind that looks like revenge. Not the kind that dances in another man's arms. But the kind that feels like peace. The kind that comes when a woman no longer waits for the apology, the closure, or the recognition. The kind that rises when she becomes the witness of her own worth. She doesn't need to be loved back to believe in her value. She doesn't need his text to validate her silence. She doesn't need to know if he regrets it. Because her life no longer centers around being understood. It centers around being whole. And now he walks through the ruins of what they once had, not realizing she is no longer there. Not the version he knew. Not the woman who shrank to keep him comfortable. Not the one who dimmed her light in the hope he'd one day notice it. She has become the fire. And he is left with the ashes. What he thought was rejection was actually redirection. What he saw as abandonment was liberation. And what he called silence was, in truth, the sound of her soul remembering itself. If he wants to find her again, not as a fantasy, but as a woman, he must do what most men fear: descend. Not into her world, but into his own darkness. Face the shame, the loss, the father wound, the fractured mirror of his own masculinity. He must walk through the shadows she once carried for him. Because love does not bloom in dependency. It thrives in the soil of self-confrontation. And only then, only when he no longer needs her to heal him, will he be capable of loving her. But by then, she may no longer be within reach. Not because she's bitter, not because she's cold, but because she is free. There comes a moment, sacred, irreversible, when a woman no longer waits to be chosen. She remembers that her power was never in being seen, but in seeing herself. And that moment, though invisible to the world, is an earthquake to the man who once mistook her silence for surrender. He feels it in the absence of her warmth, in the stillness where once there was devotion, in the void where once she spun constellations from his chaos. He doesn't know when she left. Not really, because she didn't slam doors. She didn't burn bridges. She didn't scream enough. She simply stopped making him the center of her becoming. That's the wound now. Not that she left, but that she evolved, and he stayed the same. And here lies the most brutal truth of all. The silence he's addicted to isn't hers. It's his own. The silence of a soul that never spoke its truth. The silence of the boy who wasn't heard, now living inside a man who doesn't know how to listen. The silence that echoes when you realize you were not rejected, you were revealed. Jung called it shadow work, the art of turning toward what we fear in ourselves. And her silence was the catalyst. She didn't abandon him. She handed him the mirror, and what he saw wasn't her absence. It was his own emptiness. He wants her back, but not for who she is now. He wants the version of her who bled beautifully, who waited for breadcrumbs, who mistook his emotional avoidance for mystery. But she is no longer addicted to potential. She no longer writes poems to the ghosts of men. She no longer craves love that must be chased, proved, or earned. Because when a woman reclaims her soul, she does not become bitter. She becomes mythic. She moves like poetry wrapped in armor. She smiles like someone who's seen hell and decided never to go back. She speaks less, but every word lands like scripture. And this is what tortures the man who thought her silence was a phase. He realizes she is no longer accessible in the way she once was. Not because she's distant, but because she's discerning. He doesn't recognize her anymore. Not because she changed overnight, but because he never saw her clearly in the first place. And in this confusion, he begins the slow, grueling process of reckoning. He replays the moments he dismissed her needs. He hears, now in haunting clarity, the things she said with her eyes when her mouth had already given up. He remembers the time she went silent not to win, but because she was already gone. The feminine is not a performance. It is not the softness he expects, the submission he imagines, the savior he desires. It is chaos. It is clarity. It is the storm that destroys illusion and the stillness that follows. And until a man learns to sit inside that storm without trying to fix it, own it, or run from it, he will only ever love the idea of a woman, never the woman herself. So now he sits, not because he wants to, but because there is nothing left to distract him. Her silence has taken away the noise, and what remains is his truth. Not the one he told others, not the one he used to convince himself he did everything he could, but the raw truth that she saw him, loved him, waited for him to rise, and when he didn't, she rose alone. This is the reckoning that breaks men open. Not the leaving, not the silence, but the realization that she didn't leave to hurt him. She left to heal herself. And no matter how many doors he knocks on, how many poems he writes in her absence, how many times he dreams of the way she once looked at him, he knows the truth now. She isn't coming back, because she no longer belongs in the world he created. She belongs to the one she found within. And now in the quiet aftermath, after the longing, the reaching, the late realizations, and the soul-aching regrets, what remains is the most sacred truth of all. She didn't leave to hurt him. She left to heal herself. There is no revenge in her silence, no bitterness in her boundaries. She simply outgrew the life she built inside of him, the soft prison of hope, the exhausting script of proving her worth. She no longer kneels at the altar of being chosen. This is the apex of feminine individuation, the moment Jung spoke of when the anima is no longer projected outward, but integrated within. She has reclaimed her emotional body. She no longer serves as a muse for unawakened men. She becomes her own myth, her own sanctuary, her own mirror. And he is left with the echoes, because there is no pain quite like realizing she was not the thing to be conquered. She was the catalyst for everything he refused to feel. She was the sacred wound that could have led to his transformation, if only he had stayed present. If only he had seen her not as a balm, but as a mirror. If only he had loved her beyond need. But now the hunger means nothing. The late-night texts mean nothing. The apologies written too late, sent into the void, mean nothing. Because the woman who loved him is no longer the woman he's chasing. She is no longer seduced by the cycle, no longer flattered by confusion, no longer addicted to waiting. She knows that a man addicted to her silence is not a man who can meet her soul, because love is not what keeps him tethered to the absence. Love is what allows him to let go, to face himself, to sit in the rubble of his projections, to burn away the mask. If he does that, truly does that, perhaps one day he will love again, but not in the way he did before, not with need or possession or fantasy, with reverence, with presence, with the ache of knowing that real love begins where addiction ends. And she no longer watches the door. She no longer wonders if he will knock, because the woman who walks through her own fire no longer waits at thresholds she outgrew. He became a chapter, one marked not by betrayal, but by becoming. He taught her the ache of self-abandonment, and for that she thanks him in her quietest moments. Not because he loved her right, but because his absence revealed the parts of her still begging to be filled. And now she fills them, with art, with solitude, with prayer, with truth, with the light of her own becoming. She does not chase, she does not plead, she does not explain the depths of her silence, because the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.